Do you find that Mr. Depp has proven all the elements of defamation? Answer, yes.
May the jury find the defendant, Kyle H. Rittenhouse, not guilty.
May the jury find the defendant, Taylor Denise Shabiznis, guilty of first-degree intentional homicide as charged in count 1 of the information.
From our gavel-to-gavel coverage of live trials to highlights from the most explosive courtroom moments, Law&Crime Network dominates in the true crime space. Our more than 5 million YouTube subscribers show true crime is having more than just a moment. But why is it that we have such a fascination with true crime, or even fictional crime?
There are a lot of ideas and hypotheses about why we like true crime and scary stories. Although, interestingly enough, the same people who like scary stories don't always like true crime and vice versa.
Forensic psychologist Dr. Joni Johnston says it's normal to have a fascination with true crime or scary movies. But there's a difference.
So I think true crime is interesting because there's obviously a very real component to it. And so that is something I think that adds a whole different level of seriousness to it, as opposed to, for example, talking about something that is, a scary story, a scary movie or whatever.
As we move into the so-called spooky season, we're taking a closer look at why millions of Americans have an interest in horror movies. According to Johnston, about 54% of Americans would willingly line up to watch a scary movie.
And it seems like some of us are just wired differently. So when we look at some of the research, we find that, for example, people who are kind of sensation-seeking, kind of thrill seekers are more likely to like scary movies. Younger people are more likely to like scary movies than older people. Men in general are more likely to like scary movies than women. There's some personality traits I've already mentioned, kind of the thrill-seeking. People who are extremely empathetic, who are unable to put their empathy aside, tend to not like scary movies as much. But the other thing is, it's not just our personalities.
Whether your villain of choice is Michael, Freddy, or Jason, Johnston says audiences can find safety in watching a scary movie if you follow a specific recipe.
There have to be 3 things present in order for anybody to enjoy scary movies. One is a sense of physical safety. So we have to know that we're safe. They have this protective frame, which is why a lot of people don't like to watch scary movies by themselves. Because even if they know they're real, they're not real. There is this sense of like, I don't feel quite as safe when I'm by myself. The other one is kind of a psychological safety, particularly around the ability to kind of detach from the situation, be able to put some distance. There's some research that suggests that people who have a good imagination tend to like scary movies, but I personally think that's kind of on a bell curve, because people who are super imaginative, I think, sometimes have a difficulty having some psychological distance. So I think there's a certain amount of imagination that's necessary in order to kind of get in the story and enjoy it, but there has to be enough that you're not so caught up in it that you get super scared. And then the third kind of psychological or safety mechanism we have to have in place is a sense of, I can handle this sense of self-efficacy. I'm able to handle whatever the situation kind of comes about.
And there's a valid reason why viewers keep coming back to Haddonfield or Camp Crystal Lake.
It's almost like an exposure therapy in a way. When we watch a scary movie, we get terrified. Watching the same movie over and over again, it may not have the same level of fear involved because we've already seen it, but we still have those same emotions. And so it's almost like a car mechanic who takes their car, or a person who takes their car in to a car mechanic to get it tuned up. It's like we're giving our fight, flight, or freeze system a tune-up. It's like a practice run. And so when you think of it that way, that we are in some ways very adaptively, particularly if we have anxiety, we're very adaptive in terms of, hey, we're exposing ourselves to situations where we're experiencing fear in a different way, in a safe environment. And there's something that's kind of reassuring about that.
According to Johnston, something happens chemically to viewers when they're taking in a scary movie. Whether it's seeing victims run from Leatherface or Ghostface, it triggers something primal in our brains.
Well, we're getting a lot of cortisol in our system. Our adrenaline starts flooding. We basically are tapping into a more primitive part of our brain that we have had, since the beginning of time, which basically is saying when we're afraid, there's a part of the brain, the amygdala, where hippocampus, all in that area. When we experience these emotions, we are tapping into kind of primitive part of our brain that is geared towards survival. And as we've evolved, and this is the adaptive part in terms of anxiety or in terms of enjoying that kind of controlled fear, is we're able now to use our frontal cortex, which is the part of our planning and thinking and more, decision-making part of our brains, to decide what situation we're going to put us into. But that part of our brain that was, fighting off saber-toothed tigers or whatever, years ago, is the same system that's still firing. We're just creating a controlled environment in order to exercise it.
Studies show watching a scary movie with friends or even strangers at the movie theater creates a sort of bond.
Well, I think if you ask, if we had 1,000 people that we surveyed, I guarantee you, and these are all scary movie lovers, I guarantee you 990 of them would say, I'm going to do it with somebody or in a group. And I think there's a couple of reasons. One is it does give us a sense of psychological safety to be around other people, but there's also some really kind of interesting research that says it increases our bonding with other people, sharing the experience with other people that we're friends with, and it can actually stir up some dopamine.
All that means there's a reason tickets to a scary movie are often purchased on a first date.
If we're on a date with somebody, it's almost like that excitement absolutely can carry over with that date. And so there, if you're out with somebody and you like this person, you both like scary movies, it isn't a bad idea to take them to a scary movie, because there is some carryover with that kind of attention and excitement that people will report, hey, my date was kind of, exciting. I really noticed this. And so, it does all kinds of things for our relationships as long as we both are on the same page.
With a vast range of options within the horror genre, Johnston says your scary movie preference likely stems from your background.
Well, there are some people who, have a very religious background, and they really, really don't like movies that have, satanic themes or have occult themes, because those are too scary for them. And I think the reason for that is because maybe that feels too real or too familiar to them. So I think I would imagine that a lot of that really is based on, again, life experience and personal experience.
But this horror movie fascination didn't begin when Janet Leigh was stabbed in the shower, or even decades later when Bruce Campbell found the Book of the Dead. Johnston says people have had a fascination with murder for centuries.
100 years ago, maybe 200 years ago, there were people who were dying to get to the courtroom and watch somebody who was on trial for murder. That's not anything new. There have always been, and I think that when you're talking about scary movies, for example, I think we've always had this interesting relationship with fear. And I think this desire to conquer fear in some respects and understand it. And so it makes sense that it would be part of human nature, at least for a significant proportion of us, to want to create those situations which allow us to kind of practice working through those things.
Johnston compares scary movie and true crime audiences to someone passing a car crash. They simply can't look away.
All of us can relate to driving down the street and seeing a wreck. And even though we're thinking, I shouldn't be looking over at this, we do. It's almost hard to turn away from that. There's a sense of, this could be me. There's a sense of, how did this happen? I want to understand this. This is upsetting. All those things, it's very difficult to look away from. And so I think that's kind of, again, a human nature thing. But I don't think we leave, and there's also a sense of, at least it wasn't me, right? I'm glad this didn't happen to me. I think all those feelings probably come up in watching true crime. And I think it's important, again, to keep that distinction in mind, that there's scary movies and true crime, they are very different.
But could fictional scary movies lead to someone committing a real-life crime?
In terms of talking about whether watching violent movies leads to violence, I think if there's any or playing violent video games. There's been a little bit of research to suggest that it might increase aggression immediately after doing a violent video game because of the adrenaline rush. I'm not familiar with any valid research that talks about the link between watching scary movies and somebody who then becomes violent. And I also think it's important to keep in mind that it's good to raise those concerns, but that historically throughout time, whenever you've had a new genre, when you've had a new, like video games, for example, there are going to be people who believe that this new, whatever it is, social media, this new, video games is going to somehow corrupt the youth or result in violence.
Johnston says it's rare that true crime fans actually commit a crime themselves.
I mean, we know that most people who watch true crime, if anything, they want to help solve crimes, or they are interested in figuring out, why people do bad things, or understanding that. They're interested in safety and all kinds of things. There is a very, very, very small, I think, percentage of people who are interested in true crime who maybe do vicariously or even realistically want to study those individuals and learn from them. And we know, for example, when you talk to serial killers who've been captured, they will often talk about, studying other serial killers or watching certain shows or reading books about them. That is such an incredibly small, minority of people who actually study them.
Most often, Johnston says loyal true crime audiences just want to be involved.
We all want to understand things. I do think there's a million different reasons for that, Sierra. Some people feel important by going and sitting in a courtroom. They want to be a sleuth. They're on Reddit. They're on other web sleuths. They're trying to figure stuff out. So there's that part of it, is wanting to be a hero in some respects, or a heroine by figuring stuff out. Then there's the voyeuristic aspect of it, which we were just kind of talking about. It's interesting to be able to go and sit down there and watch, not just hear about it, but to be a part of it. To sit down and hear this testimony and see the family and see the alleged perpetrator and see all the things that are, in some respects, it's another story. And it's a way to kind of be up close and personal. And I've talked to people who literally felt like it was almost an addiction for them after a while. Who got so involved in a case, for example.
To conclude, Johnston says it's important to respect boundaries for those who aren't as interested in scary movies. But for slasher fans or ghost enthusiasts, it's the perfect time of year to indulge.
I guess the thing I would say, which is such a psychologist thing to say, is just how important it is to kind of respect where people are coming from. Meaning, don't be like I did and drag somebody to a scary movie who doesn't want to, and just realize that we all are wired differently. And if you like scary movies, though, I think there's absolutely nothing wrong with going to watch one. I mean, it is October, it is close to Halloween, and that can be a fun way to spark a little romance in your love life as well.
Reporting for Law&Crime Network, I'm Sierra Gillespie.